Welcome to It's All Your Fault on True.
Actually, I got to close my window. I realized I had it open. We
Okay.
might hear an airplane in the middle.
Okay.
And can you hear my fan? I have a fan going on.
Uh-uh.
Good, because it's warm here. We're having a heat wave. It got up to 90.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. Sorry.
I'm ready.
Okay. Countdown 3, 2, 1. Welcome to It's All Your Fault on True Story FM, the one and only podcast dedicated to helping you identify and deal with the most challenging human interactions, those involving high conflict people. I'm Megan Hunter, and I'm here with my co-host, Bill Eddy.
Hi, everybody.
We are the co-founders of the High Conflict Institute in San Diego, California, where we focus on training, consulting, coaching, classes, and educational programs and methods, all to do with high conflict. Our originally scheduled topic today, if you were listening in last week, was about high conflict divorce. But we're holding off on that for a bit to talk about a podcast that many of you have probably heard of called the Joe Rogan podcast, where he had a guest named Dr. Andrew Huberman. It was episode number 2195. And lo and behold, they were talking about your book, Bill, 5 Types of People Who Can Ruin Your Life. So one of our listeners alerted us to this, and we thought, hey, let's talk about it. And then we'll have a special announcement at the end of today's episode. So before we start, send any questions you have about high conflict dilemmas to podcast@highconflictinstitute.com or on our website at highconflictinstitute.com/podcast, where you'll also find all the show notes and links. All right. So, Bill, we are going to listen to this. It was just a very brief part of the longer episode, about 3 or 4 minutes. But we'll break it up here a little bit and play bits at a time, and then have you, we'll talk about those. All right. So again, this is Dr. Andrew Huberman, who is being interviewed by Joe Rogan on his podcast. And it's interesting. This book came out in 2018. So it's been a few years, and it sold really well in the beginning and continued to sell well, but we saw a big increase since the pandemic. As we've talked about many times on this show, and in what we're hearing from the general public and from professionals that we train, conflict is up, aggression is up. Bullying has increased. So there's more of a need for this information. All right, so let's go. Let's listen to this first part. Okay, so Bill, as they were talking about lying, Joe mentioned, as you heard, that he's pretty good at detecting lies, but not always. So when it comes to people who are lying, and in relation to the 5 types of people who can ruin your life, what's the connection there, if any?
Well, there's a strong connection because all of the 5 types lie more than average. Now, some people are really careful to be purely honest and all of that. But what we see is high conflict people often are trying to kind of fight reality and get the people around them to see things their way, which often has a spin on it, what we call cognitive distortions. They twist things into all or nothing thinking, emotional reasoning. I feel it's true, so it must be true, jumping to conclusions, those kinds of things. And so they often shade the truth. Sometimes they do it so automatically because it's part of their personality. And sometimes they're doing it on purpose because they feel like it's the reason they're lying is so much more important. And it's often based on their personality. So let me just start with antisocial personality. That's one of the 5 types. And that personality is known for lying. In fact, that's one of the criteria for diagnostic for mental health professionals, is that they are chronically deceitful, which includes lying and conning. So it's part of their personality. But let's take another borderline personality. People with that have a fear of abandonment and are willing to lie to avoid being abandoned. The most dramatic example I remember reading about was a woman whose boyfriend had decided to split up with her. She was too intense for him. And so he said, I want to split up. You're too intense for me. And she said, oh, that's terrible because I just found out this morning that I'm pregnant. And so he was like, oh my goodness, if she's pregnant, I can't split up with her. I'm going to have to do the right thing and marry her and raise the child. And so he marries her quickly. And 6 months go by, 7 months go by, 8 months go by, 9 months go by. There's no baby. It was completely a lie. But the reasoning was emotional, is that she was desperate to hold on to him. And so that's the basis of a lot of lies that you get with these 5 types of people.
So the brain is just finding a way to feel okay. The brain is finding a path back to safety, and the vehicle is lying in some cases. That would be the cognitive distortion, yes?
Yeah, but in many ways, I think it often leads more deeply a sense of I can't survive
Yeah.
without this person, and therefore lying in the service of survival is okay. And
But
so
not a conscious thought, right?
no,
These aren't
no.
conscious thoughts. It's just all the brain manufacturing whatever it needs to manufacture to keep that connection going, right?
Yes, and if you
Yeah.
picture the person as about 18 months old and as a child, and her mother says, "Sorry, kid, I'm leaving you," and walks out the door, closes the door, never comes back, that child won't survive. So that kind of feeling, and a lot of people with borderline personality disorder had attachment disruptions right around that age, around 18 months. A lot of that kind of got into their thinking, their psyche. And this is through no fault of their own. And that's so important here, is understand these disorders, these high conflict personalities were formed not because people chose them, but usually in early childhood. And so if you're 18 months old and your mother leaves you, you're going to die. So you have that same feeling about abandonment as an adult. And we see that drive a lot of high conflict divorces. And so, yeah, it's lying is part of the package. And it's really sad because the person feels like that's their only choice.
Yeah. And we heard Joe and Dr. Huberman also talk about manipulation, right? And um, we all like to think that we don't get manipulated by people, or that we can detect when we are. But is that always possible?
I think, well, first of all, about spotting lying, we're really not good at that. And all the research says that we're really not better than guessing. Um, that you got a 50-50 chance of being right. You guess somebody's lying or that they're telling the truth. It's like a coin toss. Just toss a coin and you'll be as accurate. That
Really?
we,
That
yes. Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
so that's what the research says. But do you think, based on, kind of our expertise in high conflict, that we can have a better lie detector, a manipulation detector?
I would like to think that, but I'm not so sure. I think what I what I also learned early in my years as a lawyer is I remember reading a study that said it's better to read documents than to watch somebody in cross-examination. And the reason why is if you have a high conflict person and you're cross-examining them, they have a lifetime of knowing how to lie. And so they're skilled at this. And if you watch their body language, go, oh, he just seems so honest and sincere. I've consulted on cases like this where we were able to figure out the person is lying, but they convinced a jury, they convinced judges, um, and it's a sincerity that they can convey. That's why, like antisocial personalities are good at conning people, and they con people to do all kinds of things they wouldn't do if they knew the truth. So we have to understand, especially antisocial personality, and to some extent narcissistic personalities, are invested in fooling you. And they have a lifetime training in that. And you're not going to catch their lie just looking at their face. But if you read documents, and this is great in legal cases, because I get to read documents and find out this is what they said to this person, this is what they said to that person, this is their behavior, this is when the police caught them 3 years ago and they didn't tell you about that, but we found that case. Then you start putting the pieces together and realize this person's lying. But if you just looked at them, you'd probably be convinced they were telling the truth. So we're not all that great at that, and we need to be humble and know our limitations and dig for the facts rather than guessing based on somebody's face.
Yeah, yeah. So I think in my own experience, I've become much better at suspecting falsities
Well,
and
and I
people
think you're
who are
better at
lying.
that. I
I
think you are better at that because you've been trained in being suspicious.
Right, but it's also a calculation as well. Knowing the basis of these personality types, these 5 types, you can kind of compare it against the other 90%, which is what Joe and Dr. Huberman talked about quite a bit, was that 90% of everyone else. And when I think, okay, 90% of other people would never do this thing, and things aren't adding up, and that's just not normal, then I really get my antenna up, my spidey senses. And I think maybe I was probably pretty vulnerable about that in the past. I was susceptible to being probably conned. Somewhat of a big heart, not that's not combined wasn't combined with good spidey senses. So I probably started from a low bar to begin with. Anyway, so let's move on to something else they were talking about, which is threat sensing. And I know I've in my trainings I've been talking a bit about how to create a threat reduced environment, which may be a little bit confusing to people, but they were talking about they're pretty good at threat sensing, except in this domain, meaning this 10% of perhaps high conflict people. And in fact, I think Dr. Huberman said he has the equivalent of a stuffed animal at threat sensing. So I think it's a matter of awareness and really being skeptical, as you said earlier, um, and doing that calculation. What do you think?
I think again, we have to be humble about our limitations because of
Mm,
how we can be manipulated. I know there's some people that do threat assessment, like in the workplace, and they have criteria and checklists and such things to consider. I think you and I might be a little bit more aware, but I wouldn't count on myself. I'd want to get an expert to say. And what's interesting is I went to a threat assessment, threat assessment for college campuses training. And it was led by an FBI guy who had previously been in the Secret Service, checking for threats. And what's interesting, the research I was telling you earlier about lying, they say judges, college sophomores, customs agents, all these are no better than average. But there's
mm,
one group they said that was better than average, and it was Secret Service. And it may be because they're so threat focused, so, deception focused and danger focused. But anyway, what he said is he had a case where, as a Secret Service, that there was a woman who had been writing threatening letters to the president like 15 years ago. And so his job was to have lunch with her once a month, just to make sure she wasn't escalating too much.
Hmm.
But he said she had a therapist, and he got her to give him permission to talk to her therapist. Her therapist had absolutely no clue that she was writing threatening letters to the president. It was just totally off the radar. And she had never mentioned it, and he never had any, there was never any suspicions in that direction. So I guess I want us to be really cautious about, you might think but consult the experts and consult more than just the way people look. One of the big things, I should say, I think his name's Paul Ekman, the guy that read faces, that
Hmm.
studied faces in all these different cultures. One of the things he says, there's no obvious thing like that someone's lying, like that everybody scratches their nose when they lie. That's not true. But he said, if you see changes in the person's behavior, that they're doing something different from what they normally do, then maybe there's an increased chance they're lying, or an increased chance that they're a threat, that they're dangerous. So noticing changes, and frankly, this is so important for parents if they have teenagers, for example, who are doing fine, and suddenly there's a lot of things that change, secretiveness, maybe just threats. Maybe they're saying, I feel like I hate so and so, I wish he was dead. That you have to pay attention to things that like that, and things that are a change.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, interesting. I didn't know that about detecting lying, because you see a lot of courses and online about how to detect lies, and there are lots of people claiming to be experts, and maybe there are some, but that's a really interesting note there, that it's the changes. Yeah, because lots of people scratch their noses, right? And any
Yeah.
of us can be nervous, but it doesn't mean we're lying. But we may have the same action, like scratching our nose or shifting in our chair or something. So,
Yeah.
well, let's take a break, and then we'll come back, and we're going to talk about a little bit more, hear a little bit more from Joe Rogan and Dr. Huberman, and we'll talk more about that.
Do you want me to talk about, I had a case where there was a 4-year-old girl who said her daddy touched her and such. And then I saw the CPS interview video of her, and they're talking and this and that. And then tell me what happened. She changes her voice into a growly voice. And then he did. Blah, 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 blah. And then they talked about, like, oh, do you like that teddy bear? Oh, yeah, I like that teddy bear. And then, where did your daddy touch you? He touched me. And it was just fascinating. And it was false. We were able to prove it was
Yeah.
false. Do you want that?
I don't know. I mean, it's
Okay,
great. I'm wondering if we should save it for when we do the 5-type series.
sure. That's fine.
Okay, cool. Because that's a really good one, and because we'll be talking about that. Okay, so let's come back. All right, we are back, and now we're going to listen to a bit more of Joe and Dr. Huberman talking about conflict and drama. All right, so as you heard Dr. Huberman say, Bill, he loved your book, and thought that it was really interesting to read about people. There are actually a smaller percentage of the population that are difficult people than he and probably the general population believe, because I think it's because that one person in our life makes it seem huge, right? Like there's so many people like this, but it's really typically just a small number of people. But there are people who like conflict, people who like drama, people who like creating it. And then he talked about from the book, 5 Types of People Who Can Ruin Your Life, that this type of behavior, this high conflict personality, is evenly divided between women and men. So is that true?
Yes, I would say the breakdown of these 5 types is like, say, I mentioned borderline personality disorder. And the big study that was done 20 years ago, the only one of its type in the United States, they studied like 43,000 people. Anyway, they came up with it was right around equal, men and women, with that. And as a therapist, I'd always thought that was primarily women in the past. But he mentioned the research supports the idea that male people with borderline personality, and this is mood swing, and we'll talk more about this in the coming weeks, but wide mood swings, that also fits men who commit domestic violence against their spouses or partners. And so that personality is present in a percent of men and a similar percent of women. They said in that study about 6% of adults. Other studies say 2% of adults, but that's just one example. Narcissistic personality, primarily men, but significantly women. Histrionic personality, turns out the study showed about 50-50.
And that's always completely shocking to people.
Yes.
Because we have this built-in bias, as you and I both know. We've polled audiences around the world about whether they're more female or male of these types, or about equal. And every single room we've ever had, at least from my experience, it goes the same way, where they really they get the narcissist statistics correct and the antisocial, but not the borderline, histrionic, or paranoid. And that histrionic, I think, we have a built-in bias that, we watched old black and white movies, and, someone would get really upset, and, the woman would be really upset and histrionic, so to speak.
Right.
And the man would slap her across the face and, or shake her to get her out of her histrionics. And so I think that's just embedded. And that's kind of, from this study, a false stereotype.
Yeah. So men can be just as dramatic, just as seeking of attention. I think with YouTube and everything, you see men doing crazy things to get attention. You see a lot of the movies nowadays, drama. What's that? Hangover 1, Hangover 2, Hangover. Everyone's dramatic. And one of the shows you like is The Office. Say there's a little bit of histrionics there coming from a male character.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and you misspoke, Bill. I don't like that show, The Office.
Oh.
I love it.
Oh, okay.
I know every line from every episode, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. So yeah, it is kind of interesting, about the histrionic personality type, that I think it's really hard, because we think the word histrionic puts in our brain that it's somebody that's hysterical and super, dramatic and weeping and out of their mind. But it isn't just that. It's someone who's just attention seeking, has to be the center of attention, doesn't like it when they're ignored. The brain starts to go into cognitive distortions, and, whatever it takes to get attention again. Right. So
Yeah.
It isn't just this histrionic woman, which is false. It's that someone seeking that attention when they're not feeling okay.
Yeah. And that one turned out to be 50-50. And that's
Isn't that fascinating? Yeah.
So borderline, almost 50-50, histrionic, 50-50, paranoid, was it 43 to 57? It's within a 60-40 range.
Yeah.
Narcissists a little higher, but 38%
Higher men.
female. And then, higher men. But they say, since that study, that women have been learning to become more narcissistic in our culture.
Yeah.
And I think some of since the study was done 20 years ago, we've had a whole series of young actresses and musicians that a lot of people say, well, she's such a narcissist and things like that. But antisocial is the only one that seems really to be about 3 to 1 male to female. And that's more, seems to be more hardwired. And that seems to be consistent for decades, if not centuries. So that's the one that's not equal.
Yeah, and the audience always gets that one right.
Yes.
So there's some, some knowledge, some expertise, but there's also built-in bias, I believe, and just experience over your whole life. But it is fascinating with the antisocial. I've also read that it's really the hardcore trauma, like the most severe trauma, can end up with antisocial personality. So maybe someone who's been abused in really weird ways by their mother, or someone who's perhaps locked in a closet and physically abused and starved and things like that. Is there truth to that, Bill?
I'd say there's truth to that, but it's only a portion of antisocials have a terrible history like that. More than probably the other personalities, there's a percent of them that are born this way. And this is what, the diagnostic manual says there's a stronger connection to parent and child, just passing this down in families, that this seems to have more of a biological connection, which also explains why it's so hard to treat this personality. And this is often associated with crime. I've seen several studies, about 40% of prisoners have antisocial personality disorder. And it makes sense. It's an enduring pattern of behavior that repeats and repeats. If they get out, there's a high risk of recidivism and they'll be back in. Now, with everything we've said, I want to make sure I have a cautionary note, and that is that there's deviation within all of this. So there's people that are antisocial without being criminals. There's people without the drama who are histrionic. They want attention but don't have the same drama. Borderline personality, etc. And there's treatment like borderline personality. There's some good treatment for that, dialectical behavior therapy. And so I want people, especially if you know someone with one of these diagnoses, or you wonder if you have one, is that these are tendencies, but there is more hope now than ever before that people can learn through intensive counseling to overcome some of these patterns of behavior. So I don't want people to judge people with these conditions because they really started in childhood and they had no control of it. But also be aware there's these patterns of behavior so that you also don't get hurt yourself if they happen to include some dangerous behaviors, which not all of them do, but more than average do.
Right. And kind of coming full circle is that, there are those with these disorders who may not have a high conflict personality.
Yeah.
I think probably most do. That's just my opinion. But anyway, so now let's move on to the next part of their conversation. We'll wrap up with this. Okay, so Dr. Huberman was talking about the great set of protocols that you put in the book, Bill. So talking about don't move in with someone before you've known them a year. Don't entangle your finances. Don't buy a house. Don't have a baby together. Don't do anything that's going to be super permanent. Maybe get a tattoo, right?
That's okay.
That's okay. You can cover that up, or you can live with it or something. But these other things are going to potentially be costly, and they will take a toll in some way, maybe on your emotional health, and some can be lifelong. If you have a child with someone that has a pattern of lying or abuse in some way, it's life altering.
Yeah, and it's important to know that people with these personalities, some of the people with these personalities, are very invested in covering up their full range of behavior. And it may be 3 months, 6 months before you find out that your partner is physically abusive. and then they start hitting you. Usually within a year, you're going to see the full range of the personality. But that's why we say this. And it's for people's own safety in some cases. Domestic violence is a perfect example of this, because most partners with domestic violence don't show it at the beginning. Lying in important ways may not show at the beginning. There may be a secret life that the person
Yeah.
has. All of this. So you want to take time to get to know the person. And there's a range of how severe this is. So someone may get in a relationship with someone who, say, got a narcissistic personality, but it may be you can manage the relationship. Maybe there's enough room to work on themselves. So we don't want to, make absolutely all or nothing suggestions here, but people need to be aware that 5 to 10% of the people in the world are different in their approach to relationships and conflict. And you want to protect yourself and not be surprised, and also know what to do, like the protocols, how to calm someone if you have someone like this in your family, how to set limits and impose consequences. All of these things come up, and they may help you manage the relationship, especially like in the workplace, someone that's your boss and they got a high conflict personality, but you may be able to manage them enough to make the job tolerable until you get your retirement in a year or two, things like that.
Right, right. Okay. Yeah. And kind of the last point they touched on was those spidey senses, right? Would 90% of people do that behavior that they're doing? Because a lot of us, most people, I think, want to assume the best in others, that they're not going to cheat, they're not going to lie, they're not going to lie when they know they can get caught, or they're not going to rage. And so we want to think the best, but we have to use, like you said, our spidey senses. You just have to use your own brain, right? And pay attention to gut feelings, because they're in your right brain.
And read my book.
And read the book. So speaking of the book, and we'll wrap with this. So thank you for that, Bill. And I want to give a shout out to Joe Rogan and Dr. Huberman for giving a shout out for this book, because sales are up. But we are going to launch, starting next week, a series on this book, 5 Types of People Who Can Ruin Your Life. And I think you'll really enjoy it. We're going to dive deep into all of the 5 types, just all the different nuances about them, and the things that you can do to protect yourself, identify, things like that. So thank you for listening, everyone. We really appreciate it. We'd love it if you give us a thumbs up or a like somewhere. Send your questions to podcast@highconflictinstitute.com, or submit them to highconflictinstitute.com/podcast. And until next time, keep learning and practicing these skills. Be kind to yourself and to others, while we all try to keep the conflict small and find the missing piece.